I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so happy that you guys have chosen to join on this Thursday afternoon. My workshop today is going to be on metaphor and empathy. And quickly, before we get started on that, I'll give you a little introduction about myself. So obviously, my name is Diane. I was the 2022-2023 National Student Poet of the West. And so just 2-3 years ago, I was like you guys, I submitted to the Scholastic Art Writing Awards and the wonderful honor of being given a medal, became a National Student Poet, which was an incredible year. And now I'm a sophomore at Harvard studying philosophy and linguistics. And that's a large part of the reason why I chose to do this workshop today, because a lot of what I'm interested in now, largely influenced by my time as a National Student Poet, is in the philosophical and linguistic background of metaphors. And really excited to share a little bit about what I've been studying and what has driven me to have so much passion about metaphors. And also quickly, I noticed somebody mentioned in the chat, I'm from Houston. I was the National Student Poet of the West, but I was born and raised in Houston, and then I moved to Seattle, which is that's why I was the West poet from then. But anyways, quick little rundown of what today's workshop is going to be, just some structure. So first, I'm going to introduce a theory of conceptual metaphor, just like a linguistic theory about metaphor. Then we'll talk a little bit about how we can apply that in writing. I'll share a poem of my own. We'll just talk a little bit about some of the conceptual metaphors in that. And then we'll go through 2 different ways that I think that metaphors are really applicable in our lives in building empathy and reshaping thinking. And finally, we'll do a little writing exercise. And at any time, if you have questions, please feel free to put it in the chat, and Kristine will relay them to me, and we'll also have a Q&A section at the end. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about this presentation. If you have questions about anything, I'm really happy to answer. Cool. So, theory of conceptual metaphor. The theory of conceptual metaphor was originated by a linguist named George Lakoff. And essentially, it says that the essence of a metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of experience in terms of another. And that seems relatively straightforward and in line with what we know about metaphors right now, right? So, for example, if we had a metaphor like the moon is a pearl in the sky, we can apply what we understand from one conceptual domain. So what we know about pearls, which is that they're valuable, that they're beautiful, they have like a natural creation to them, right? And we apply that to whatever the target of our metaphor is. And so through that, we can expand the dimensions of whatever the original object is by applying a different experience. And here's an example of a metaphor that is quite common in everyday life that we don't even often realize is a metaphor, is time is money. And this is a really common expression, and it actually becomes quite influential in the way that we think about time as well. And so we're experiencing time, that concept, through experiencing money. So what our understanding of money is influences our understanding of time. And some of the ways that is expressed in our everyday lives is, for example, if you've ever said, I'm spending time with my family, or I'm wasting time doing this. Or saying something like, I took a shortcut and I saved time. And so these things are not actual things we can do to time, right? So these are all metaphors that we're saying about time. But because the metaphor of time is money is so ingrained within us, these sayings seem very commonplace, but that's because we've applied our conceptual understanding of money to time. And that allows us to think about time as something that can be saved, that can be spent, that can be wasted. And so here's another example of a sentence. I'll give you a few moments if you can maybe just take a little gander at what you think the conceptual metaphor in this might be. It's a little bit tricky. It's the looking forward part, specifically to tomorrow. And so it seems so incredibly obvious and like natural to our metaphysical understanding of the universe, at least in English, that the future is ahead of us, right? We look forward to the webinar tomorrow. We look backwards to the past. But that's not necessarily true, right? a lot of the reason why we think that is because they are ingrained within our language. So they're structuring the way that we think, and they structure the way we think about time, which seems to be something so intuitive and so foundational to ourselves that it's almost crazy that it could be anything different. But in a lot of other languages, they use different conceptual metaphors, and so they think about time differently. So I'm Chinese American, and one way that kind of differs in Chinese is for tomorrow, they say 后天, and 后 means behind. So tomorrow is behind in Chinese, and yesterday is in front, 前天, with 前 meaning front. So depending on the metaphor that you use, it can actually adjust your concept of time as well. And the reason why I think that this theory of conceptual metaphor is so fascinating is because it means you're able to understand things that you otherwise would have no experience with, or adding more dimension to things that you may not know the most about by using these different conceptual domains. And I'll give you a quick example of something that might be like that, right? So I'll share a poem of my own, and this is a poem that I had the wonderful honor of being able to share at the White House with First Lady Jill Biden and the US Poet Laureate Ada Limon when I was a National Student Poet. And I'll read it to you, but you can also read along at your own pace. And it's called A Recipe for Steaming Almost Dragon. Every few centuries, when the carp gathered at the base of the Longmen and thunderclouds, riled with legend and youth, we waded into the brinks of the waterfall and waited. That night we would feast upon Qingzhonglong. First, check for freshness. Its scales should be taut, a bowstring still drawn long after the arrow has departed. Its eyes should be clear, a divine glimmer of a future once promised. Its gills should be stark red, the intrusion of fate into viscera. Second, dress it to your liking. With a blade, furrow its body in angles, such that its exterior still lays neatly. Only you should be aware of the aromatics buried in its torso, of the ginger rooted in its nervous system, of the scallions that replaced arteries. Third, steam for 7 minutes. In death, we replicate glory with an opiate haze. Here we unwind the dreams tucked in little carp skulls, lacy hemlines of cascades, the rumble of cast iron gates opening, the pale heat of the heavens. This is flesh cleaved from the mountainside, skin sheened in gold, and bones that prickle at the roof of the sky, still tasting faintly of thunder. And then the last two are just explaining some of the references in Chinese, but you don't necessarily need to know the references, which I think is what's so interesting about metaphor in general. The reality is that the world is so incomprehensibly vast and expansive and complex that we'll never know every single niche reference and mythology that an author is referring to. But metaphors are so often grounded in everyday things, right? And so in this poem, what I was doing, or at least hopefully what ended up working, was I was appealing to a fairly niche Chinese myth. It's about the Longmen, which is this dragon gate, and this idea that a carp that leaps over the waterfall through that gate becomes a dragon. And that was supposed to be applicable to this theme of, being ambitious and not necessarily fulfilling that goal. But you didn't necessarily need to know that, because we try to capture the essence of that using a metaphor with a conceptual domain that's a lot more easily accessible and available to you, which is a recipe or a kitchen. And that's the structure that I used and the kind of metaphor that framed that overall poem, which hopefully helped you understand that a little bit more. And so this is just one of the ways that I try to apply metaphor in my writing, and hopefully something that maybe you do unconsciously, because there are so many ways, as we mentioned, that metaphor unconsciously structures the way that we think, the way that we write. And so if you can be a little bit more intentional about that, you can be very specific about the ways in which you write in a way that no matter where the reader is coming from and no matter what specific experiences you're writing from, you're able to meet in a really common ground. Awesome. Next, we'll go on to talk a little bit more so about the tools that metaphors can give us, not only in writing, but in life in general. And it's that I think metaphors are absolutely wonderful because they build interpersonal empathy. And I've mentioned or alluded to this a little bit, but one of the ways that is because understanding a metaphor is to bridge to someone else's conceptual domain. And a conceptual domain, in the theory of conceptual metaphor, is essentially the group of concepts that make up whatever object or topic you're talking about. And everybody will associate different concepts with a different conceptual domain or a different topic, right? Because everybody has different experiences with things. And so one person might associate the sea with the beach and having a wonderful time, and the other might associate it with drowning and like Jaws, right? Everyone has different conceptual domains, but we're able to find common ground, right? And furthermore, writing a metaphor is forcing you to extend out of your own conceptual domain. So instead of looking just at what do I know about pools, what do I know about recipes, you have to think about what is the conceptual domain of the metaphor that I'm extending this to, and how can I find a common overlap in those conceptual domains in order to create that metaphor and bridge that metaphor. And so what metaphor really makes you do is that it not only forces you to think about other people's conceptual domains, but it also forces you to kind of look for places in which you can accommodate their concepts, and allows you to begin to integrate those concepts within your own conceptual domains as well. And that's why in psychological studies, it's been found that increased metaphor usage is actually associated with increased empathy and perspective taking. And so one example of that would likely be, so I'm in finals week right now. So it would be something like, how was the exam? And then I would say, I'm cooked. And my friend very likely did not have to take that exam. They don't know what it's like to have gone through that terrible, awful exam, right? But they're still going to be able to relate to me and understand my experience by traversing through that common conceptual domain. So the exam, the conceptual domain of the kitchen, so what we can both agree upon, since hopefully everyone's been to a kitchen or knows what a kitchen is, and then my friend. And now we're both able to understand somewhat this private, personal experience through this shared conceptual domain of the metaphor. The second way that I think, oh, no, there's another slide. Here's another example of a way that we can use it to build empathy between really disparate experiences. So Christianity and Taoism both have euphemisms for death. And obviously death is universal to every human culture, everywhere. And so in the Western world, oftentimes a euphemism for death will be called back to God. So this idea of like going to heaven and leaving earth. And in Taoism, you have 现实, which means to leave the mortal plane. And so now you're able to find that both very extremely different religions, different ideas about even what it means to be on Earth, what it means to leave Earth, are able to agree somewhat on this conceptual domain of death. And so that, again, creates a kind of common ground for you to talk about these different concepts between very disparate things. So the second way that I think that metaphors are useful in our everyday lives are because it allows us to reshape our perceptions as well. So, as I mentioned before, metaphors and conceptual metaphors specifically have this unique and incredible power to very subtly change the way that we think about the world and structure the way that we think about a world in a way that we don't even realize. But that power and the relationship between language and perception is bidirectional. And so we use metaphors to process the world, but we can also reprocess the world through metaphors as well. And I think this is incredibly useful for things like grief, because studies have shown that the use of metaphors actually creates cognitive restructuring, which is a type of psychological technique where you think about issues in a different way that makes it significantly less distressing in therapy. And the reason why I think this is so is because using these metaphors allows you to apply a different conceptual domain to the original topic that allows you to associate much more positive or just less negative emotions or connotations with that subject, and oftentimes look at something in a better or positive light. And so an example of the different ways that metaphors can shape our perceptions of things would be in something that seems as simple as love. And so I'll give you a few seconds, and maybe you can think about some of the different conceptual metaphors that we have in our culture in general about love. Here are the two main ones that I kind of came up with, which is love as war versus love as collaboration. And so these are two different ways that we can perceive love. And I personally think love as collaboration is the preferable perception, but personal choice. But the different ways that that metaphor gets expressed in our language are, for example, for love is war, we might say something like, I'm pursuing her, right? Or I'm backing off. Things like that that are alluding to the idea of battling, or like I'm fighting for her affections, those types of statements. While love as collaboration would be something more like, she's my better half, right? So something that's thinking about teaming up and joining up together to do something bigger and better. And so which metaphor you choose to use says a lot about which way that you think about love, but that's not set in stone. And so you can be intentional about which metaphors you want to use. And as such, be intentional about which way you want to think about the world. And so that's the way that I think that metaphor is incredibly powerful, is because you're able to take that, once you're conscious of the fact that you've associated this conceptual domain of war with love, you can switch that. So you can actively choose to say, I want to associate a conceptual domain of collaboration or dance or some other type of less hostile, less aggressive thing, in order to transform it into something that is more productive, that makes you happier and less distressed. Those are the two main ways that I think that metaphor is helpful interpersonally. I think we can go back to writing now, and we can do a quick little writing exercise, which I think will be very fun. So you can write a line, you can have a poem, or you can just brainstorm a little bit about the following metaphor: grief is a raft. And I'll give you, I think 10 minutes would be good to write. And then you can share in the chat if you feel comfortable. If you don't feel comfortable, totally fine. But I'd love to see what you have to write. So
please don't share like your whole brainstorm list in the chat though. Like pick your favorite part.
it's wonderful seeing everyone's writing. I think it's actually incredibly beautiful to see. And I think, not to toot my own horn, but I think it really proves my point that everybody has very different experiences about even what a raft is and what it means for something to be like a raft. And I think it's also really beautiful that everyone is loving each other's poems, and hopefully you guys will write together. I think one of the best parts about being a national student poet when it was my year was having 4 other national student poets who were really incredible people who I got to spend time with and talk about poetry with. So if all you get from this webinar is a new friend to write poetry with, I think that is an incredibly amazing thing to get out of this.
Diane, I think it's really interesting too how like for me, when I read that line, grief is a raft, I immediately went to like a raft going down a river.
Mhm.
But then so many other people are mentioning like oceans, and the brainstorming that Emma shared, like that, there's so many ideas, to work off of there. It's always interesting to me how the same words create such different imagery with different people.
Mhm. I'm not sure if what regions everyone's in, but if you haven't hit the deadline yet, maybe this will inspire an entry. What else? Um, cool. I think we can move on. I'll share. You guys can feel free to keep writing if you're feeling inspired. But I will go ahead and share the poem that kind of inspired the prompt that I gave you guys. And this is by Chelsea Rathburn. Um, A Raft of Grief, very to the point. Um, and I'll read it again. You guys can just read along. The raft that means a great number is not related at all to the raft that carries people or their possessions to the water. The two words are homonyms. If only there were a boat, low and long and loaded, with all we'd brought or built, the fatal inattentions, anxieties, and ticks that time had sanctified, our good and bad intentions, rages, lapses, and aches. If only it were that easy to stand only ankle deep in the sullied water, hoisting our shared cargo, sinking no further beneath its weight. If only the boat did not need a rower, we'd push it off together and wade to opposite banks, absolved at last, forever, buoyant, watching it go. Um, and so this is a beautiful poem that is obviously about a raft of grief. Everyone can interpret it differently. Again, it's going to depend on your conceptual domain of a raft, right? The way that I thought about it was the that the raft carried their grief again. So loaded with the fatal inattentions, the everything that hurt, and everything that was good as well. And they wanted to push it away. But that's if only. That's not how rafts actually work. They do need a rower. That's my interpretation of the poem. And you guys can put your interpretation there as well. That's kind of all the content I had planned for today, so we can go into the Q&A now if anybody has any questions, and then I'll also just stop sharing. And don't worry, I know that a lot of people wanted to know if you could get the slides. I believe they'll be sent out along with the recording as well later on.
All right, if anybody has questions for Diane, write them in there. And
And since you guys are also talking in the chat, it might be easier to just use the Q&A, like actual option thing.
let's see. Adeline asks, when writing using metaphors, is it okay to somehow connect what you want to express in a different part so the reader may be able to like realize, for example, talking about tears and sadness after talking about a harmful raft?
Of course, I don't see any major problem with that. I think a lot of people say, you want to be subtle with poetry. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think there's also elegance in being able to just say what you want to say, right? And so I definitely think it's fine because it's also, you'll have multifaceted poems as well. And so you can have multiple metaphors that are connecting to the same thing or even bridging. So you can have metaphor go to this conceptual domain, and then from that domain go to a third one, and so on and so forth.
Jaime is asking when you started writing poems. And then May is asking, who are some of your favorite poets?
Oh my gosh. I started writing poems in middle school, specifically in sixth grade, and this is why I think it's super important to have a writing friend. Is it was me and this very close friend of mine. We would sit together in math class, and I'm not good at math. So, and part of the reason why I'm probably not good at math is because I would spend math class writing instead, and we would just kind of pass poems and short stories back and forth to each other. And I think that really started my love of poetry. And then it actually got solidified, I think, when I got my first, I think it was a key in my freshman year, maybe for the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards. And I was like, oh, maybe I am good at this. And then I kept doing it a little bit more intensively. As for my favorite poets, I would say I really like Ted Kooser. I'm a huge fan. I think Ocean Vuong is wonderful. Um, Louise Gluck. I Naomi Shihab is wonderful as well. Um, I think it's difficult for me to answer. Oh, Chen Chen is really wonderful. I don't think I tend to look at poets themselves. I more so look at like singular poems that I really like, I would say.
Oh, let's see. Lolita says, this might sound silly, but I feel like a lot of the times I feel unconfident in my poetry, especially since I've gotten rejected a lot. So how can you tell if a poem is bad? I'm not sure how to put it, but I guess underdeveloped.
Yeah, I also feel that a lot. I remember when I was first named National Student Poet, I was very like nervous. I felt a lot of imposter syndrome. Um, and the reality is that I really don't think there is bad poetry. There's poetry that perhaps doesn't resonate with other people, poetry that perhaps isn't the most technically sophisticated. But I think it's about what you want to get out of the poem. And so for a lot of people, a lot of the poetry that people say is bad is oftentimes extremely emotional, extremely personal, and people are using it as a form of therapy and venting. And so I don't think that can be considered bad poetry, right? If you want to write a poem that is like a technical masterpiece, then that's like a different criteria, perhaps, that you would put to it. So I would say in evaluating a poem, first I would look at what my goal for that poem was. And then I look at if I achieved that goal. And so if my goal for a certain poem is to evoke a certain emotion in a reader, I might show that to a friend and then be like, do you did you get that emotion? Or like, how did you feel about that? And I might have to adjust depending on that.
Audrey is asking, she really likes your references to the Chinese folktale. Do you usually reference traditional Chinese literature in your poems? How were you introduced to forms of inspiration?
Yeah, thank you so much, Audrey. Um, I wouldn't say it's like a super common theme. It definitely occurs somewhat often. I it's I would say in terms of finding inspiration for poetry, a lot of it is just your everyday life. I remember I taught a workshop once at the Montana Librarians Association, which is about finding poetry in everyday life. And I really do believe that there are a lot of poetic sources all around us, um, that when you stop and look at it are incredibly fascinating and incredibly interesting, things that we take to be really normal. And so a lot of like what I know about Chinese literature, Chinese fables is just from the fact that I'm Chinese American and that's what I grew up with. But for writing challenges, I would challenge you perhaps to kind of think of two unrelated things, like grief is a rat, for example, and try to find a way to connect those two. Kind of like the literary way of like the Wikipedia speed run, if anybody's played that game. Um, but I think that's a really great way to kind of test out different types of inspiration.
Can you put your email in the chat again so that they can access it? Some of the kids missed it before and it's way up there. So if you put it in again, then they can snag that.
Yeah.
Skyla says, recently I've been wondering if the immense technicality of a poem can take away from the emotional aspects of it. I'm not completely sure how to word it, but how would you ensure that the passion or ardor remains despite making it technical? That's a great question.
That is a really good question. I think that the crux there is thinking about why you want it to be technical. And there's a lot of poetry that exists and is technical to be technical. And I can understand that, like from a linguistic perspective, that poetry like fascinates me too, right? Like wordplay is fun. Um, but I think the ultimate goal of poetry oftentimes is that passion and ardor. And technicality can help you achieve that. And so if you keep in mind that what you're doing, the technical aspects, the techniques that you're using, what that ultimate goal is, that goal is to convey passion, then you will be able to stay on track. Especially, I think, is being willing to prune unnecessary complexity or prune unnecessary technicality. Because I think sometimes, and I've definitely, been a victim of this, where you do something technical just to prove that you can do it, right? Just to be like, oh, this is really cool, and I'm so smart. But once you've written it, like, you're smart, and now it's about, do you know you're a good writer? Do you know that this is going to be something that is going to be fun to read? And then you can move on to proving other things.
That's interesting. I remember one of the writing groups I belonged to years ago. I shared a couple pieces, and two of the women there considered themselves fairly elite poets. And they were like, well, technically, though, you don't have the right, you know, they were technically like trying to tear it apart. And I was like, well, but that's not what I was doing. Like, I wasn't trying to write a technical piece. This was just kind of an emotional. And so it's interesting that you say that, because I'm with you on that. Like, if the author doesn't have, if there isn't that oomph behind it, that feeling, then the technical part is not going to keep people reading. So that was a perfect answer, Diane. We have a very, very, I think, advanced question here from Natalie. I'm interested in pursuing philosophy in college. Any advice on how to organize philosophical ideas into digestible writing?
Oh my gosh, that's a perfect question, because I literally, right before this, I came from my office hours when I had this paper, a philosophy paper. I think that the best part of being able to be digestible, a lot of people say like dumb it down or whatever. I don't think that's necessarily true. The thing that makes philosophy the most digestible, to me at least, is being structured and well structured and explicit about your structure. And so being able to say, like, argumentatively, like X, Y, and Z, I'm relying on premise X, I'm going to reject premise Y, this is how I'm going to conclusion Z. That allows them to follow it much, much easier and digest it. And the contents of the actual things, reasonably, I think, as long as it's well structured, people will be able to figure it out. But the most difficult part, I think, is having an argument that has a ton of moving parts, and then you don't know how they are coherent or how to put them together. And that's, I would say, is like the biggest philosophical skill. But also, I'm still an undergrad. You should probably talk to your professor once you get to college about that.
I think it's good to get advice from someone who's in the ditches, so to speak. There's a
Yeah.
couple questions along the same lines here, asking about when you're writing poems or in poetry in general, I guess, would you keep the meaning discreet, or do you try and be more obvious about it?
Um, I don't have a personal preference. Like when I write my poetry, it ends up just going whichever way I think fits the theme of the poem better. I've definitely read poems that are subtle and I think are amazing that you have to really sit with and really kind of process over and over again. And there's poems that you get just immediately on the first read, and those are also really impactful. So I think this is maybe not the most helpful answer, but it definitely is dependent on the poem itself.
Yeah, so kind of a follow-up with that, I hope her name, well, their name is pronounced May. How do you balance clarity of idea and metaphor? How do you ensure your work is understood? And I think that goes right along with what you were just talking about. Like,
Um,
do you feel like, is it even your job as the poet? I mean, to make sure that it's understood by people.
uh, you can never make sure your work is understood, and this is like a big thing in like literary theory, I think, is Um, I don't know if anyone's ever read like The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes, but like you you produce the work and then you just leave it there and then everyone else interprets it, right? And so you really can't force the reader into anything, but you can give them the best tools to interpret it the way you want it to be interpreted. Um, uh, so in terms of balancing clarity of idea and metaphor, um, I think they go along pretty well. In that if you have a metaphor that you've thought quite a bit about and you have very clear direction of how those domains or ideas overlap, then the idea itself will also be very well developed and very clear.
We're getting a lot of questions about Harvard, like how you got in there, extracurricular, how you like it, things like that.
Yeah, for extracurriculars, I mean, I was national student poet, which there's also from my same year, in the freshman class is a friend of mine who's national student poet of the South, Midwest, of the Midwest, Emily. And so she's here. And then from the year above me, also of the West, Sarah Fatima is here. And then outside of poetry, I also did debate. So I was on the USA National Debate Team, and that was my other main extracurricular through high school. I did debate for 7 years. How do I like Harvard? I really like it. I will say, and this is something that I didn't realize in high school, and I don't know if you guys are applying yet. I think it took me being here to realize that I would be happy and successful at any school. But again, I don't think I would have realized that if I didn't come here because I definitely did idolize Harvard when I was in high school. And I do think that the grass is always greener on the other side. And so perhaps maybe if I had gone to another school, I'd have been like, oh, life would have been so much better if I was at Harvard. But now that you're at Harvard and you eat at our dining hall and you get chased by the rats, and then you're like, no, life would definitely perhaps be better elsewhere.
I feel like there's a metaphor in there
Yeah.
waiting for you to write a poem about. Ew.
Yeah, if anyone,
I'm right back at a restaurant in the French Quarter of New Orleans where a group of my friends were having a meal and a rat ran across the back bench behind them at a very well-known, very famous chicken place.
oh my God. If anyone's interested, the New Yorker actually interviewed me for an article about the rats in the Harvard freshman dorms. So that's out there on the internet if you Google me.
I will definitely. Do you know what issue it's in?
I don't remember. It was I don't remember. It was
I'll just type in your name with the New Yorker. Look at that. I am friends with someone who's been interviewed for the New Yorker. That's what I'm going to
yeah,
tell everybody. One of my BFFs goes to Harvard and was in the New Yorker.
no, exactly.
There have been a number of questions asking about the connection with poetry and music, and if you've ever written music or lyrics, things like that.
Um, I've always wanted to try, but no, I haven't because I have like a musical two left thumbs. I played violin and cello as a kid, and then I started with violin. My teacher told me to quit because I was really bad. And I did cello, and then my teacher told me to quit because I was also really bad. So I'm not musically talented. So I've never tried that.
That would be interesting though, because I do feel like poetry and lyrics are I mean, they're so similar. And you would just need to find someone to put those to music or find a tune that went with it. But um there's a couple also along this kind of theme, and I'm just going to use Hannah's question. Is there a way you distinguish ideas for poetry and other pieces of writing? I feel like sometimes it's difficult to choose to write a poem over like a short story or something, some other genre.
Um, Honestly, I don't think there's anything stopping you from writing both. Sometimes I was never really a short story person. I wrote mainly poetry. But sometimes I've been in the process of writing a poem and I've thought that it would make a really good short story, or I've had an idea for a short story that translated into a poem. Um, so I think, yeah, there's nothing stopping you from writing both. I think more writing, the better.
Adeline asks, is there a good way to summarize a poem? Do we point out our interpretation or what we want the reader to take away?
Um, to be honest, I don't think poetry is something that's very easily summarized because a lot of it's in the details. If you're summarizing it for like perhaps just reference purposes, then maybe just
Or
pointing
like a
out,
submission, maybe?
oh,
Oh,
like a
some
submission.
submissions were
Yeah, then I would maybe just probably point out the main idea. So I would say something, maybe the way I would summarize the poem I shared with you guys of my own, as saying something like um a poem exploring failed ambitions through the lens of Chinese mythology and recipe.
oh, now we're getting rat stories. Here's a very deep question. What does hope mean to you?
That's really deep.
I know, right?
Wow. I
Something
think
to round out the evening.
hope means perseverance, I think. Uh and being able to keep going in the face of futility and absurdity.